share now.
Thank you for joining us at the MaREI Biofuel Symposium. I would like to introduce you to Professor Anita McGuire, who is the Vice President for Research and Innovation, to have our official welcome. Over to you, Anita. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Good morning, everyone. It's a really great pleasure for me to have an opportunity to welcome you this morning to this Biofuel Symposium, featuring researchers from the SFI MaREI Centre for Energy, Climate and the Marine, working in collaboration across universities and across disciplines, focusing on an extremely important area of research. The symposium today will feature the work led by 3 leading research teams in the gaseous fuel circular economy systems, led by Professor Piet, Professor Xinmin Zhan, and Professor Jerry Murphy. What I particularly like about the symposium today is that it's researcher-led. Each of the researchers is breaking down their work into just 6 slides, explaining the concepts and the ideas behind their research to a broader audience. And the ambition is to allow the audience a full understanding of the complexity of their work from just these brief 6 slides. I'm sure that was an interesting challenge for some of the researchers in trying to encapsulate years of work into just 6 simple slides. I think there's great credit to all of the research teams involved in moving what was originally to be a physical symposium with people in the room together, sharing their ideas and sharing their research, to a completely online event. We must also thank the funders who allow this work to take place. So that's work funded by SFI, the EPA, SEAI, DAFM, Marie Curie, the Irish Research Council, and the industry funders, Irish Distillers Limited and Gas Networks Ireland. So you can see that the work that you're going to see today has really attracted the attention of a large number of different funders from different perspectives, really highlighting the interdisciplinarity of the work that we're going to see here today. Evidently, organising a meeting of this type, it takes a significant amount of work behind the scenes. So I want to particularly thank Tara Reddington, Archie Bowes, Yan Liang for coordinating the meeting today and making it possible. I would love to stay and hear the presentations. I love watching early career researchers talking about their research, but unfortunately I'm unable to stay with you for the day. But I'm sure you'll have a very exciting day of discussions, sharing ideas, and I'm sure out of the discussions today, new ideas will emerge for future research projects. So the very best of luck, and I'm sure it'll be an interesting day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita. We appreciate that. I'm waiting for my camera to go live. Can you turn off your video, Anita? Thank you. So we're delighted to have 24 researchers from the MaREI Centre in Cork, in Galway and Trinity College Dublin. This is an exciting time to see a vast array of research across circular economy, hydrogen, biogas upgrading. The MaREI Centre is the Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine. We have about 200 researchers, 50 industries, and it's a very exciting centre driven by the research of our young researchers. Today's event is divided into 2 sessions. Our software package allows a maximum of 3 hours, so we have a break after session 2, and you will be given a link to join the second session after that. We have 4 topics: circular bioenergy and biorefinery system, hydrogen economy, biogas production, biogas upgrading. We have 2 chairs. The first session will be led by Arkisman Bosie, and the second session will be chaired by Yang Ying. The questions will be submitted through the questions and answers, and the questions will be published by the facilitators. We've allowed 3 minutes of questions per presenter, but it's at the end of the session. So if you look at the timetable, for example, we have a 20-minute discussion after the first session where all the questions can be discussed. Both sessions will be recorded. They'll be shared on the MaREI website so you can look back on the process. We will also upgrade the presentations. For those of you in social media, please use the hashtag MaREI Biofuels. That's hashtag MaREI Biofuels. I do hope you enjoy the presentation. I would like to introduce you to the first chair, Arkisman Bozy, and he will take us through topic 1, circular bioenergy and biorefinery systems. Over to you, Archie.
Apologies, there's some sound errors. Archie, can you turn on your mic, please? Thank you.
Sorry, I'll go again. Thank you, Jerry, for asking me to be the chair and giving me the opportunity to chair this first session of the MaREI Biofuel Symposium. So without any delay, I would like to start our session on circular bioenergy, and what we will do with our first presenter, Richard Lin, is look at a broader perspective on bioenergy systems, which looks at a cascading bioenergy systems with carbon capture and utilization. So over to you, Richard, for your first presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Archie, for your introduction. I'm very delighted here today to present my research on the cascading bioenergy system with carbon capture and utilization. So that's the topic. If you go to the next slide. And here in this slide, it shows the opportunities of anaerobic digestion-centered carbon capture and utilization technologies with a short term of ADCCU. There are many different technologies in renewable energy area, such as wind with solar from marine sector, and also power to gas for renewable hydrogen production, bioelectrochemical systems for CO2 reduction and fixation. We also have technologies, anaerobic digestion, biomethanation for biogas and biomethane production. There are also thermochemical technologies such as pyrolysis and gasification for the valorization of solid digesters for biochar production. And among the different technologies, anaerobic digestion offers a very compatible platform so that many other technologies can be integrated with this. However, moving on to the next slide, with so many individual technology and options, we want to ask that how these technologies can be best integrated to maximize their potential, especially in terms of the energy output and sustainability. Moving on to the next slide. Trying to answer this question here, we propose 3 anaerobic digestion-based bioenergy systems. Upright, that's the conventional anaerobic digestion with amine scrubbing for biogas upgrading. In the middle, you can see it's the anaerobic digestion and power to gas based biomethanation. Down below is the third system, anaerobic digestion with microbial electrolysis cell for biomethanation. For system 2 and 3, the both includes the pyrolysis of solid digesters for biochar production in the cascading circular concepts. So by doing the mass balance of different systems, it allows us to track the specific flow of each component from input feedstock, for example, cattle slurry, to the final products in the form of biomethane, syngas, bio-oil, and biochar. And here I didn't include the details for calculation. But what we found is that anaerobic digestion with microbial electrolysis cell has the highest biomethane yield due to the highest CO2 conversion efficiency and the highest feedstock biodegradability. And the ADMEC system almost doubles the methane yield as compared to the base case. Next slide, please. And based on the mass balance calculation, we can then calculate the net energy yields and greenhouse gas emissions of different systems under different scenarios. And here we assess the three scenarios in terms of the energy supply to power to gas and microbial electrolysis cell. The first scenario is to use the curtailed or constrained electricity for power to gas and microbial electrolysis cell. The second scenario is to use renewable electricity, and the third scenario is to use grid electricity. And due to the fact that each scenario has very different primary energy factor, in other words, energy efficiency, the results are very different. For example, if using grid electricity, both power to gas and MEC cannot produce enough energy to offset the energy inputs. And that is to say, the system performance depends absolutely on the source of electricity. And for the potential of greenhouse gas emission savings, it comes from three sources, as indicated on the right side of the slide. The first source is the biomethane production to replace diesel. And the second is the avoided fugitive greenhouse gas emissions from cattle slurry if it's used as feedstock. And the third is the CO2 sequestration by biochar. To further amplify the impacts of such a system of ADMEC, we analyzed its application in three regions, including EU, China, and the US, which have very different CO2 intensity of electricity. This helps us to quantify how much energy and greenhouse gas emission savings can be achieved in different scenarios. And finally, we found that in best scenario, advanced biofuels in the form of biomethane, bio-oil, and syngas can provide 1.6% of global natural gas demand and reduce 2% of greenhouse gas emissions from the three studied regions based on the data in 2018. Moving on to the next slide. In addition to the desktop study, we've also looked at experimental studies on the topic of integrating anaerobic digestion and pyrolysis with the use of biochar in digestion to promote direct synthesis species electron transfer. We published a few papers on this topic, and generally we found that the optimal system can increase biomethane yield by around 20%, and it also can reduce digestive amount by a level of 25%. And also we conclude that biochar can achieve comparable performance to high-cost nanomaterial graphene as a proof of concept material. And I think that's all I want to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Richard. I must ask you to keep sending up your questions, and we will publish it at the very end of the session. And please let us know your name and whom the question is getting addressed to, so we can reply to it well. So for our next presentation, I would like to invite Dr. Richard O'Shea from UCC, and he will talk about how we can decarbonize alcohol. Over to you, Richie.
Thank you very much, Artishman. If you can go on to the next slide, please, Dara. So as Archie introduced me, my name is Richard O'Shea. I'm a senior postdoctoral researcher in University College Cork, and today I'll be speaking about the decarbonisation of alcohol using anaerobic digestion. So if you go on to the next slide, you'll be able to see the greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland in 2017. So taking a step back, looking at where our greenhouse gas emissions occur in Ireland, the majority of them are related to energy production. That's through the combustion of primarily fossil fuels. Looking at that energy production, you can see that about 12% of it occurs in the manufacturing and process industries. So this would be food and beverage processing, it would be cheese making. So drilling further into these sectors, you can see that that food and beverage sector is responsible for about 20% of our energy-related greenhouse gas emissions in manufacturing. And this is about double the contribution of other European countries and the global average, primarily due to our large agricultural basis in this country. Looking into the food and beverage sector, the primary sources of greenhouse gases are the combustion of liquid and gaseous fossil fuels. So going into the future, if we want to decarbonize our food production system, we need to replace these fossil fuels with renewable energy sources. A certain amount of the process can be electrified. However, this is difficult for high temperature processes, specifically evaporation and distillation, as the heat required in these processes is quite high temperature. If you can go on to the next slide, please, Dara. So one of the ways that you can produce renewable thermal energy in the food and beverage sector is through the use of anaerobic digestion. So looking at a large distillery in Ireland, you can see that it consumes about 254 gigawatt hours of natural gas, which is a significant amount of energy. The byproducts of whiskey production consist of draff, thick stillage, and thin stillage. These are residues of the brewing and distillation process following the processing of malted barley, unmalted barley, and maize. Currently, these byproducts are converted into animal feed, dubbed moist grains, dry distillers grains, and syrup. However, it is possible to convert these byproducts, draff, thick, and thin, into biogas. On the next slide, you'll be able to see that using these byproducts in an anaerobic digester, the biogas can be consumed on site in a boiler to produce steam, and this steam then can be used in the distillery operation. The idea is that the biogas would replace natural gas. This would reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the distillery in terms of its Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, and it would also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions under the emission trading scheme. If you were to digest all of the byproducts available at the distillery, you could offset about 61% of the current natural gas demand of the plant. When you digest your byproducts, you no longer produce animal feed, so your energy consumption at the distillery actually reduces. As such, you could replace about 64% of that reduced energy consumption. The majority of the biogas comes from thick stillage. So thick stillage is analogous to whole stillage from the production of maize, corn, or maize ethanol. Following this, thin stillage, the residues from pot distillation, and draff, the residue from barley brewing, can supply the next largest share of biogas. As well as this, on the next slide, you'll see that when you use draff, thick and thin, or any other food processing byproduct, you can produce digestate, a mixture of solid and liquids left over after the anaerobic digestion process. And this mixture contains phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as other nutrients that can be used as fertilizer to replace synthetic fertilizers applied to land. So knowing how much digestate is produced from your anaerobic digester, knowing the nitrogen content and the phosphorus content, you can work out what land bank is required to spread this digestate on, knowing how much nitrogen and phosphorus can be spread on each individual parcel of land. So you can quantify how much fertilizer you could replace, how much greenhouse gas emission savings you could enable by replacing that fertilizer, and also you can get a handle on, well, how big is the land bank? How many kilometers do I have to drive in order to spread this digestate? Because that is a key issue in terms of public acceptance of AD plants, specifically road traffic movements. On the next slide, you'll also see that when you stop producing animal feed, it may be, in a worst case scenario, required to import some animal feed to replace what you would have produced. So looking at the amount of animal feed imported into Ireland and the various types, I was able to create an optimization model to figure out what would be the most likely imported feeds to replace the feed that would be produced if you use distillery byproducts in an AD plant. And it's primarily distillers grains from the USA and soybean meal from Argentina. The total national increase is only about 5% and 2% respectively of the total mass of each imported feed in 2018. And finally, summing it all together, it is possible then to create a greenhouse gas balance, for example, where you can look at the emission savings associated with replacing natural gas by biogas, dubbed your Scope 1 greenhouse gas emission savings, as using digestate on agricultural land for the cultivation of barley or cereal consumed within a distillery can also reduce your Scope 3 greenhouse gas emission savings. Importing and producing animal feed may result in the emission of greenhouse gases. So these would negate some of the emission savings that you would achieve through the implementation of an AD plant. Summing all of these together, you could get a total greenhouse gas emission saving of about 5,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. However, this leads to another question as to, well, which one of these criteria is relevant to a company in the food and beverage sector? Is Scope 1 emissions the only thing that people care about? Do Scope 3 emissions also come into the equation? And should companies be concerned about the emissions associated with animal feed, which are outside of their supply chains, over which they have no control? Depending on your parameters and your criteria that you choose to select a project, it may be possible to actually use a portion of each byproduct in order to achieve an overall optimum or a trade-off between maximizing your Scope 1 savings, your Scope 3 savings, and possibly minimizing the emissions associated with importing animal feed. So this kind of analysis can be done for other large players in the food and beverage sector in Ireland in order to aid further decarbonisation of this industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richie. A very interesting talk. For the next presentation, we will continue with our brewery wastes as a source of green chemicals, and it will be presented by Juan Castilla from NUIG. Juan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I don't know if you can see the presentation or not.
We can see the presentation, Juan. We can roll.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to talk, thanks so much for the presentation. Currently I'm doing the PhD with Professor Piet, but I was working before previously for a couple of years here in Ireland. And with Professor Piet, we designed these experiments. The idea was using brewery spent grain for production of grain chemicals. So in the next slides, we can see the reasons we choose brewery spent grain is like we started to do a screening of the different products that we could try to use for industry, and we decided to go with brewery spent grain because this is a low-cost biomass, it's the most abundant side stream, and because it's from the brewery's process, the composition of the brewery spent grain is quite constant throughout the year. As well, between 15 to 20 kilograms of BSE is produced per hectoliter of beer, and just in Ireland last year, more than 8 million cubic meters was produced. So this is the total amount that we produced was between 120 to 160,000 tons. And the typical composition of the brewery spent grain is between around 50% carbohydrate, lignin around 20 to 26%, protein 20-30, which is quite good. So what we wanted to produce was the volatile fatty acids that can replace the fossil sources, and Ireland depends currently on the import of that products. So for that, first we try to develop the feasibility. In the next slides, we can see the process that we were using initially. We take this brewery spent grain and in two-step processes. The first step was the thermal diluted acid hydrolysis. In this step, we use different concentration of total solids of brewery spent grain with different concentration of sulfuric acid for the hydrolysis, and we recover this liquid for the batch acidogenic fermentation or the different pH. From uncontrolled pH 4.5, 5, 6, and pH 8. So the results in the next slide from this experiment was like the best hydrolysis was using 1.5% of sulfuric acid and 7% of total solids. With this concentration, we obtain around 33 grams per liter of total carbohydrate. That means that was 0.44 gram of total carbohydrate per gram of total solid used. As well, with the different pH that we use it, we obtain at the pH 6 was the higher concentration of volatile fatty acids in terms of gram of COD, was approximately around 20 grams per liter. So this was the acidification level, which means the contribution of this volatile fatty acid of the overall soluble COD was 93%. So now that we demonstrate the feasibility production of the volatile fatty acids produced per grain, the next step was the development of the continuous process. We changed a little bit this two-step process by adding some substeps. So in the next slides, we can see we have the respect grain, we have as well the hydrolysis process, but now what we did was we take the solids and wash it with distilled water. We use the same amount of the water that we recover in the liquid. Once again, we filters and we recover this liquid and we join the two liquid fractions. So in the first fraction liquid, we obtain around 33 grams. In the next liquid fraction, we obtain around 5-6 grams of total carbohydrates per liter. So this means that we increase the yield of the carbohydrates from 0.44 to 0.49, just washing that. What we do now was this liquid that we obtained, this mixture liquids from the hydrolysis, we neutralize it because the pH was around 1 at this point. So we neutralize it to pH 5 to use the pH 6 in the process, in the continuous process. So in that neutralization, we have some precipitation, and we remove this precipitation and we use the liquid for the fermentation in a continuous acidionic fermentation. So in the next slides is the system that we use it. It was an expanded granular sludge bed reactor. Mainly this trial was divided in 5 phases based on the hydraulic retention time. We were feeding in the inlet concentration was 15 grams per liter. So that means that the organic loading rate was from 10 to 15, 20, and 30 grams per day liter. So the best volatile fatty acid production was a phase 2, that when we obtained a total soluble COD in the outlet at 60.29 grams per liter. The volatile fatty acid concentration in that case was 11.7, so this is a acidification level around 83.4%. The major compounds at that phase was acetic acids, butyric acids, propionic, and as well there was a higher production of ethanol when we have no production of ethanol in the batch reactor, and a small fraction of soluble COD that was not recognized. So just going to the next slide, this was the previous process. So what we want to use is to develop the Biorefinery process for the respect grain. So this is maximizing the potential of the products that we can obtain for the respect grain. So in that case, what we want to do is the 2 solid fraction that we mentioned, the solids in the phase 1. So we wash these solids to remove any of the further sulfuric acid, and we want to use this as a source of lignin. In the case of the precipitated that we have there like a 40% of non-volatile of products, so that will be metals. But also we see between the before and in the liquid before and after the neutralization, we see there is a decrease of protein. So we want to analyze and further investigate this as a source of protein. So that could be like closing the whole loop of the respect grain for these 3 different products. So thank you so much for your attention, and please let me know if you have any question or suggestion with the analysis for this solid characterization. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Juan, for your lovely presentation. So as you know that nothing is a waste at this moment, and we need to add more value to our waste. So you heard about adding value to brewery waste. Now we will going to hear how we can add value to food waste. And this will be presented by Simone Pau from NUIG. So Simone, the floor is yours.
Hi, hello everyone. If you can put the presentation, thank you. I am Simone. I am a PhD student in Piet Lens Group, and I'm focused in the bioconversion of food waste to get carboxylic acid. And so on the next slide. Thanks. Why food waste? Because food waste nowadays is a very huge problem. FAO estimates that more than 1/3 of the total food produced globally in the earth became waste. And this food waste is produced in every step of the food supply chain, from the production, from fields and farms, to the household and from the graph in the top part. These produce quite a lot of environmental impact, as the increasing of the greenhouse gases associated to the food waste that in the last 50 years increased from 608 megatons to 2.2 gigatons. According to the new principle of the circular economy, food waste can be seen as clean and renewable substrate from which we can derive biofuels and biochemicals. Among the biochemicals, lactic acid is a strongly increasing product, especially because of its utilization for the production of PLA, that is the most common bioplastic in the world. Lactic acid is also used in the food industry, in the pharmaceutical, and in the chemical. So the research objective of my PhD is to reach a new biorefinery setup in order to maximize the lactic acid concentration from a green substrate as a food waste. Next. So to do so, I started with the batch test. I tried to compare different inocula in three. The first was a compare between two different pH. The first was pH 7 using a phosphate buffer, and the other one was an uncontrolled pH. And the third condition was a thermal pretreatment of the food waste. The food waste that I used was synthetic. I took the composition from the literature, and I created it in order to replicate the composition of a restaurant food waste. I will not first, and if you can go to the next slide, I can show the first sludge is the primary sludge. This is an aerobic sludge. From this graph, we can see mainly two things. The first is that acidogenesis starts after 24 hours with a complete degradation of the sugars, and that the lactic acid was produced just in the pretreated case. That was the only one that reached a pH below 4. A net of VFA, mainly butyric acid and acetic. This is confirmed in the next slide. This was a control with just the food waste with no inocula. As you can see, in the last two cases, we have a net accumulation of lactic acid, and also in this case, we had a pH that was lower than case with the buffer, we have no lactic acid accumulation. This also proved that just the food waste had an original microbial community that was suitable for the lactic acid production. I can conclude with the next slide. So in conclusion, we can say that the thermal pretreatment improves the hydrolysis process, but not the acid. So was not a justified pretreatment. That the food waste showed alone the best lactic acid production, and that among the sludge, the primary sludge results the only one that shows accumulation of lactic acid for all the experimental time. And then we can say that the best range of pH for a good lactic acid production is between 3.8 and 4. I want to say how my PhD will be carried on. I set up two USB reactors in order to investigate the K parameter, so to push as best as I can the OLR and reduce the HRT in order to have the maximum lactic acid production in the minimum time, and then set up a membrane extraction mode to try to improve the actual methods for extraction in lactic acid industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone, for the wonderful presentation. I would like all our audiences to keep sending in their questions, and we will make it public at the end of the session. So our next presenter is Sinead from NUIG, and she will talk about Duckweed Biorefinery. Over to you, Sinead.
Hi everyone, my name is Sinead and I am in Professor Piet Len's group. So today I'm going to talk about Duckweed Biorefinery. So if we can go on to the first slide. So this is still in the conceptual phase. So the plan is to use duckweed, which is an aquatic plant, in the production of biofuels and biogases, as well as high valued chemicals. So we initially plan to be able to grow duckweed in wastewater treatment to then harvest the biomass and either use it in anaerobic digestion for biogas production or in fermentation for the production of biogas or biofuels, after which the experimental design should address what to do with the liquid or with the solid phase. So can they be used in a phytobioreactor or as a soil fertilizer? So we can move on to the next slide, please. So to begin with, what is phytoremediation? So phytoremediation is using green plants and associated microorganisms to uptake chemicals or toxic environmental contaminants from the soil or from the water. So other researchers have looked and shown that duckweed is capable of remediating different types of wastewaters, and specifically some researchers have looked at Lemona gibba, which has shown the potential to remediate chromium and cadmium with removal rates of 98 and 94%. While a species Lemona minor has shown a 30% removal rate for chloride. So using duckweed as phytoremediating capabilities, we can then harvest a biomass. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So when we harvest a biomass, we can use it in two different processes for biogas or biofuels. So if we look at the gas process, producing biogas using anaerobic digestion or by fermentation is considered a green technology. So primarily researchers have been focusing on using duckweed in AD for methane production, with very few studies looking at the focus on dark fermentation for hydrogen. So the questions we want to ask, is it possible to use duckweed in large-scale hydrogen production, and what yields could be expected? Moving away from producing biogases to biofuels in a liquid process, some studies have indicated the potential to use duckweed in an ABE cycle for ethanol and butanol production. With this, like biogas, what yields can be achieved and how successful can it be? We know that ethanol fermentation plants produce massive quantities of carbon dioxide, so would it be possible if we use duckweed in this manner to capture the carbon? Some additional studies have also used duckweed in fermentation for the production of high-valued chemicals such as succinic acid. So can duckweed be used to produce other high-valued chemicals? Yeah, next slide, please. So alongside producing biogas and biofuels, we're left with a solid and a liquid phase. So the liquid phase is rich in NMPs. So what can this be done with this? So could we use it in an algae phytobioreactor? By using the NMP as a flow in the digester, can we produce high-valued chemical compounds, such as pigments or pharmaceutical compounds? Or additionally, could this high nutrient-rich liquid be used to further cultivate duckweed? And then if we look into the solid phase, can the solid phase be applied to land or to soils? And if so, will it help? It'll help improve the organic matter content, and if so, can it help in carbon sequestration? If this is possible, could this be a benefit to the peatlands in Ireland? Could it be applied and help with the peatland storage? And the final slide, please, to conclude. So the overall outlook, so using plants and resources as a biomaterial or bioenergy removes the need on non-renewable fossil fuels. And unlike burning fossil fuels, using a plant biomass in this way could potentially lower the CO2 emissions compared to fossil fuels. Additionally, using duckweed biomass as a feedstock could help address the food v fuel debate. Generally, duckweed isn't consumed by humans and therefore wouldn't be classified as food. This is still in the planning stage, so additional questions still need to be answered, with the process design still needing to be explored further. However, this could have a potential impact on how energy is produced in Ireland. So that's everything I have to say, I think.
Thanks, Sinead, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you so for all the speakers for sticking within the time. That's indeed helpful. So we can produce biofuels and all other chemicals, but we do need to make sure that these stick to the actual policy documents and what is recommended by the law of the land. So our next presentation by Aoife Long is going to discuss about the EU Renewable Energy Directive recast and tell us what are the emission savings that must be achieved by these biofuels and other chemicals. Over to you, Aoife.
Okay, thank you very much, Archie. So my name is Aoife Long, and the overall brief of my PhD has been to look into using renewable gas for heat end use. So one of the things I've looked at in particular was the Renewable Energy Directive. And the first paper of my PhD, I was looking at a green gas certification scheme for Ireland. And one of the major questions I was asking was, does the end use of the gas matter? And the answer is yes, it does. That's the short answer. So I'm going to go back and look at the existing Renewable Energy Directive first. That came out in 2009. So sustainability criteria, this is the emissions that are allowed in a biofuel pathway. And the purpose of this criteria is to ensure that the fuel can be compliant with the requirements of the national renewable energy supply targets. So if a fuel pathway doesn't meet the target, it cannot contribute to a country's renewable energy supply. It's also for measuring compliance with the renewable energy obligations. And the final one, which is major, is that if the pathway meets sustainability criteria, it is eligible for financial support. And this is particularly important for new biofuel pathways. So the fossil fuel comparator is what you're measuring your CO2 emissions for the pathway against. And in the original directive, that was set as the fossil or the emissions from the pathway for diesel, which is roughly 83.8 grams CO2 per megajoule. The saving required increased as the directive went on. So when it was first introduced, the saving required was 35%, and then this increased over time. So the recast version of this directive, this is going to come into force in 2021, has very much the same purpose of sustainable criteria. You need to meet the criteria in order to contribute towards the union-wide target for renewable energy supply. The compliance with renewable energy obligations remains the same. And again, in order to be eligible for financial support for the consumption of biofuels. So what's different, or what's particularly different in the recast version of the directive, is that the fossil fuel comparator is different depending on the end use of your pathway. So it's higher for electricity, lower for heat, and then a little bit higher for transport again. But again, the conversion efficiency of electricity and heat will be very different. The rules for calculating the emissions from your pathway are set out in Annex 5 for biofuels and bioliquids and Annex 6 for biomass fuels. So renewable gas would be considered a biomass fuel under the definition in the directive. So this is what I use to calculate the emissions from different pathways. Again, the emission saving required, that increases throughout the directive. It remains at 65% for transport, and then it increases from 70% in 2021 to 80% from 2026. So for any pathway I was calculating, I was looking at the 80% saving from 2026, just because of the context in Ireland that we don't have a gas industry up and running. But if anything is introduced right now, it would need to meet the 70% emission savings criteria. So could we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So what all of this means is that when you've different fossil fuel comparators and taking the conversion efficiency into account and the emission savings, the emissions that you are allowed for heat are the lowest, electricity is a little bit higher, and then you're allowed much higher emission saving or emissions when you're using your biofuel pathway as a transport fuel. So what the directive does essentially is that it uses the rules to almost direct the end use of your gas towards transport, rather than saying explicitly you must use a particular biofuel for transport. So if we could move on to the next slide, I'm going to go through some examples from my own research. So this is looking at the grass biomethane pathway in Ireland. And the emissions along the pathway are from cultivating the resource, from the fertilizers required to the diesel required to harvest and transport to a digester, and the anaerobic digestion process. So adding up all the emissions along the way and including carbon sequestration from grassland, the emissions before conversion are roughly 23 grams CO2 per megajoule of energy produced. So the conversion efficiency, a typical efficiency for heat, is 90%, and we are not required to take that into account for transport, which means you've higher total emissions for heat compared to transport. This is then compared against the fossil fuel comparator, which is lower for heat and higher for transport. So the emission savings for heat is 70% and transport is 77%. So you have a higher emission saving for transport. And the transport emission saving will meet the lower criteria of 65%, whereas the 70% emission saving for heat will not meet the 80% emission savings criteria. So this becomes very important for countries then to decide how they are going to use their renewable gas resource. So the next question I was asking was, is it possible to meet the emission savings criteria for heat using a resource potentially available in Ireland? So if you could go to the next slide, please. So looking at willow biomethane, this is a similar pathway. The emissions, can you just go back one slide, please? Thank you. So the emissions before conversion, they're going to be the same on either side, and then taking into account the conversion efficiency. Sorry, that was my own timer. So the conversion efficiency leads to higher total emissions, lower fossil fuel comparator for heat, different emission savings required means that you can use the fuel for transport and not for heat. So again, it's very important to consider the emission savings along the pathway and how the directive will influence the end use of the gas that different countries are going to use. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aoife, for the wonderfully detailed presentation. So we now come to our last presentation and by Zhan, and what she'll talk about is the life cycle assessment of pig manure and food waste management. And so over to you, Zhan.
Zhan is not with us at the moment, so we're going to move straight on to Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. So we can now move on to Q&A. So how this Q&A will be working is that we have received a lot of questions. We'll be publishing them, but it is not possible to answer each of them. So what I will try to do my best is to select a few of the most interesting questions, and I ask the presenters, and then if the presenters wish, after we finish it, if the presenters still have some questions or want them to discuss or add additional points, they are free to please just turn on your microphone and just give me a note and say that I want to clarify this, and we'll move on. So so a lot of questions have come up, and for the first, Richard, so I would, there was one question that was of particular interest to me as well. So what are the current applications of MEC? If you can just elaborate on this, Richard, for all our audiences, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's actually very interesting. And in terms of the applicability of MEC, so what do we think here? It's currently at very low TRL, and especially as compared to anaerobic digestion, which is already a mature technology. But MEC is largely still studied in the lab. What we found very interesting that combining anaerobic digestion with MEC can actually achieve biogas production and upgrading at the same time. In best case, it might produce biomethane from the hybrid one reactor at a level of 95% as compared to anaerobic digestion combined with power to gas. This mode, as I mentioned in the presentation, if you remember, this system would require two separate systems, reactors. So ADMEC combination in essence can only needs one reactor and achieve the biomethane production in one step. So, but again, in terms of economics, there might be an issue. We need to do more work to improve the efficiency and also lower the cost. So that's would be my point.
Thanks, Richard, for the clarification. For Richie, there is one question that stood out for me, and a lot of our audiences were interested to know. So the thing is, like, instead of while you do the improvements of using the biogas production, so there will be, you have spoken about bringing in the feed for the cattle from abroad. So one of the major questions was, can we increase the production in Ireland or any country that's so increase local production, and how do you think will benefit it in the overall scenario?
Thanks, Archie. Well, the perspective that I initially took was to look at imported animal feed, because there was worry that to replace the animal feed produced in the distillery, it would be sourced from the Amazonian basin, specifically soybean meal. However, when you look at the numbers, it falls out that it's more or less imported distillers grains and soybean meal, but predominantly from Argentina. Looking at the other side, I did calculate the amount of indigenous feed that would be required to replace the animal feed lost, so to speak, if you started using distillery byproducts in an AD plant. And I calculated the amount of barley and rapeseed meal or oilseed rape required to actually offset the loss in nutritional energy and protein once you stop producing feed. The amount of barley required in terms of the total national production of barley would vary depending on how much of your byproducts you want to use in an AD plant, but it's about 2% of the total amount of barley produced in Ireland. The amount of rapeseed meal actually is a significant portion, upwards of about 50% of all of the rapeseed meal grown in Ireland in 2018. There are positives and negatives with converting indigenous land to animal feed production. Positives would be a boost to the local economy, and it would provide an additional outlet for the tillage sector. Potential negatives might be conversion of land, might be increased CO2 emissions associated with tillage, from soil rotivation and ploughing. So there are positives and negatives associated with both systems. I suppose the reason I focused on imported animal feed at the start was I kind of saw it as a worst case scenario where, you know, there was that worry that we'd be importing soybean meal from the Amazonian basin, but it kind of falls out that we don't. So there are, as I said, benefits that could be gained in terms of promoting indigenous tillage. But again, there are issues surrounding that I haven't looked into quite yet, but it would be an interesting study that could be done in order to see would it promote the tillage sector indigenously in whatever country, be it Ireland or somewhere else in the world or Europe. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Richie. And there was one more question for you, was that how do you see the spread of digested on land affecting the carbon sequestration long or short term?
I think Richen might actually be best placed to answer this question, and maybe Jerry as well, because I see they've actually responded to it. Do you mind taking this, Richen?
Yeah, I can try to explain that. Actually, what we did in the lab is that we performed the anaerobic digestion followed by pyrolysis and also hydrothermal post-treatments, and two different technologies trying to valorize digestives instead of directly using digestives as a fertilizer. In the system that we investigated, we found that biochar or hydrochar, depending on the technology we used, can greatly increase the carbon content in the char, and it could be 6%, 7%, 80% even, depending on the original feedstock and the process parameters, especially temperature. And this carbon is relatively inert, and it can be preserved in soil for much longer time as compared to the digestives itself. So I hope that provides some points to answer that question.
one of the concepts, if I may, is that in the anaerobic digestion industry, there's a concern about land spread of digestate, and there's a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and there's potential for eutrophication. So that an area of research that's quite topical at the moment in anaerobic digestion is working on digestate, whether it's pyrolysis or whether it's gasification. We have a paper published recently with our colleagues in Galway looking at gasification of digestate as an energy source. Some of my colleagues in anaerobic digestion would see this as the devil's work, the idea of combusting digestate, which is a biofertilizer. An area of work which is getting a lot of interest is, in effect, densification of that digestate and carbonation and producing pyrochar and biochar. And in the recent European Academy's study on negative emission technology, if you put pyrochar on the land, and the pyrochars that Rich N and Chen are working on could be well over 60% carbon, you increase the soil organic carbon, you increase the yield of crops, you increase the sequestration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we see this as quite interesting, that you could have a very large digester such as at a distillery or a creamery, and instead of looking at 3 counties of Ireland and doing nutrient management balance, you could have a pyrolysis system giving you pyro oil, giving you some gases for your energy, but the pyrochar is very important, and the work of Richin is putting that pyrochar back into a digester, increases the performance of the digester through direct interspecies electron transfer, and then when it goes on land, after improving the performance of the digester, you have this negative emission technology because you're sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, increasing soil organic carbon, increasing yield of crops. So it's the ultimate circular economy, that you're closing the loop, you're sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you're treating a waste such as slurry that was emitting methane. So when you look at the full life cycle analysis of slurry to anaerobic digestion, to pyrolysis, to pyrochar, to improving the anaerobic reactor by adding pyrochar, to putting the pyrochar on the land, increasing the yield of the crops, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's quite a beautiful concept. And I think this is something we probably struggle with, in that in the world of energy or Twitter energy, there's a lot of concentration on WWS, wind, wave, solar, and we'll electrify everything. If we electrify everything, we'll still have emissions from slurry, from food waste going into the atmosphere, a global warming potential of 28. These circular economy systems are actually greenhouse gas negative, and they give you a better carbon footprint than pure turbine-driven electricity. And I think it's something we, as advocates of circular bioenergy systems, we need to make this argument understood by policymakers that we're not carbon neutral, we're carbon negative, and having digestate converted to pyrochar is a very important aspect of this.
Thanks, Jerry. So I have a couple of questions for Juan. So I'll ask them together, and Juan, you can reply them together. So for the first question was, what was the first pH in the first step of hydrolysis? And the second question was, what are the vitamins or minerals? Did you find any of them in the liquid phase? Zhan, if you can clarify these two, please.
Perfect. So in the first step, when we were testing the different concentration of sulfuric acid for the hydrolysis, we were working, as mentioned, with concentration of the sulfuric acid from 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2, and 3% of sulfuric acid. We chosen to go ahead with the 1.5% sulfuric acid in volume, in percentage of the total volume liquid volume, and the pH using this 1.5 was around 0.85, 1, a bit lower, 0.9 approximately. So it was quite low in that case. We would like now to consider even like to maybe do another pretreatment using less sulfuric acid and combining with some enzymes or another product to decrease the amount of sulfuric acid. Regarding the mineral analysis and the, sorry, I guess the question you asked minerals and
yeah, did you find any vitamins or minerals in the liquid phase?
We haven't measured so far this. What we were thinking now is like we want to consider before moving to the next step. We are trying now, even now with this time that we are more working, we are basically doing desk work. We are trying to see what kind of analysis we can try to do to characterize the proteins and characterize some of the vitamins and minerals in the liquid fraction before and after this neutralization. As well, what we were thinking is to recover the solids and resuspend these solids and make the analysis in that fraction. We haven't done that at the moment, but we are planning to do that for the next step. So thank you so much for the question. I hope that I've answered there as possible.
Thanks, Juan. We'll keep on doing the questions. So there are quite a few questions for Sinead about Duckweed Biorefinery. So I'll ask just maybe a couple. So one of the questions was, do you have any provisions for duckweed biofuels are categorized in the EU Energy Directive?
Hi, could you just repeat that question again, please?
Yeah, the question was, is there any provision for duckweed in the EU Energy Directive?
Not that I have come across within them, but it's something that I still need to look into further.
That's no problem. So there were questions about, is there a very preliminary studies of producing chemicals with duckweed?
So we haven't done any studies as of yet with duckweed, but some of the papers look at producing succinic acid from duckweed, and I came across one or two looking at lambicinic acid, but there hasn't been many papers looking at it, but there has been other papers looking at other forms of aquatic plants for high-valued chemicals.
Thanks, Sinead. And just asking briefly, what, in your opinion, would be a drawback of the Duckweed Biorefinery? So is there any drawback of that?
So the major drawback is the growth of the duckweed. So duckweed generally does grow very fast, but at times it can grow very slowly, especially if you're growing it in outside conditions. It can be heavily affected by seasonal changes, so it tends to have a lower yield in the winter compared to summer. So the growth and yield rates that could be achieved with duckweed would probably be the major drawback.
So there was one linking question, but maybe it comes in here, is that can it be then coupled to wastewater treatment?
Yeah, so duckweed can be used in phytoremediation for wastewater treatment. So there is multiple studies looking at using duckweed for a range of different wastewaters, such as swine wastewater. Some have been conducted just focusing solely on certain chemicals, but some have looked at like swine wastewater as a whole.
Thanks, Sinead. So we have lots of questions for Eva. For obvious reasons, she spoke about policy, and people are indeed a lot looking into policies at the moment. A couple of very interesting questions, Eva, about your opinion about this question is kind of controversial, but I would like to get your opinion about one question was, do you think, in your opinion, RED 2 or the recast is kind of biased towards biofuels, or is it like promoting it, or so what's your opinion on it?
I suppose I wouldn't have thought that it was biased towards biofuels in particular, as in the directive is very broad. It's very specific in how it defines whether it's a biomass fuel or bioenergy. So I think splitting out the definitions gives a lot of clarity to people. I suppose if there was any bias initially when I was doing the analysis, I felt like it was biased towards transport, and I felt like when heat is such an almost convenient end use to begin with, I was kind of unsure as to why that might be. So I think it's quite robust in terms of what it's aiming to achieve. I also think perhaps it could have, instead of using carbon accounting almost to direct an end use in a particular way, maybe it could have used different mechanisms. I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I don't think
it's your perspective. So
Yeah.
I mean, there is no answer to the question. It's just your opinion. So
Yeah.
I think that's
You're
a
happy
good.
with that.
I mean, one question was, as you showed the numbers of our CO2 reduction, one question was about your methodology and the robustness of the numbers. So how robust are those numbers, or how likely are we going to see those numbers reflected in actual practice?
Okay, so no, that is a good question. So the numbers that I used in particular for the say the emissions associated with agriculture, I would have used European data, so say European standards on the emissions from nitrogen and phosphorus and all those things. So in particular, the agricultural data can be very, I suppose, difficult to get good resources. Also, we don't have an official number for carbon sequestration in Ireland. So again, I would have used quite conservative data. So perhaps if the data was more specific to Ireland, it might be better. Also, like realistically, you wouldn't be digesting grass on its own. It would be more likely to co-digest with slurry when you get an emissions credit, and that would make it more likely to meet the heat criteria. But like it will be possible to meet the criteria for heat, but it's worth considering the overall aims of the directive. You're allowed double the emissions credits towards renewable energy supply for transport as opposed to heat. So the sustainability criteria isn't the only mechanism for directing the end use. So it's worth bearing in mind the overall aim of the directive as well. So yeah, the answer to the question is it would, like if there was data that was more specific to Ireland, then it might be more, I suppose, realistic compared to what I have used. But I suppose the analysis also demonstrates what the directive is trying to achieve.
That's a very detailed response. Thank you, Aoife. And there was one question about feedstock. So you have spoken about grass, and people have been asking co-digestion or maybe using other feedstocks. So how do you see the impact of feedstocks on these numbers? And what do you suggest? And I would like to add, how do you see the downstream process? Like Jerry was mentioning pyrochar or the use of, so the impact of the use of digestate. So what do you think might be affecting all these numbers? Just give an idea, because I know there are no numbers at this moment. So
yeah,
maybe
no, that's fine. So to give an idea of slurry, the directive specifically states that if you co-digest with slurry, that you get an emissions credit of 45 grams CO2 per megajoule. So although I haven't actually done the analysis in detail yet, I do see that if you could get the ratio right, it would be possible to meet the emission savings criteria for heat if you co-digest slurry with a lot of different, say, energy crops that might be grown. And then to add the next question on the use of digestate, etc. So that isn't actually allowed for in the pathway. So the rules are set out in Annex 6. You calculate the emissions for agriculture, for transport to your facility, for the energy use and conversion, and also the transport to where it's going to be, I suppose, to where the end use is. So if you're using digestate as fertilizer and that might displace another fertilizer, there isn't space for that in that particular calculation. And you're also not allowed to allocate emissions to the digestate end use, because the digestate is considered a residue. So this is where the directive rules differ from what a normal life cycle analysis would be. So in terms of meeting the directive criteria for, you know, eligibility for financial support, etc., that kind of thing wouldn't make a difference, but it would in terms of, I suppose, acceptability of the pathway, you know, if you can explain that the actual emissions are different to what the directive emissions are.
Thanks, Aoife, for your detailed explanation. So we are trying to connect our last presenter here. We are still not yet. So I have got one more question for Sinead, if you would like to answer it. Is that so using different alternate CO2 source for duckweed production? Have you looked into it, or do you have any opinion for using like biogas or some other, or like flue gas from any normal power plant for increasing the rate of duckweed production?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It isn't something that I have thought about or that we have looked into it. And I haven't come across it in any of the literature at the minute. So it's something that I would have to consider and look into further.
Thanks, Sinead.
Archie, may I come in a second?
Yeah, Jerry, of course.
Just talking about Aoife's work and the end use of gas, it's quite an interesting one, and we've had conversations with MaREI Donnelly, who would have been one of the authors and the leaders of the Renewable Energy Directive, and she talks about exergy, you know, that like a wood chip won't drive a truck, biogas will drive a truck, and trucks are struggling with decarbonisation. It's very, very difficult to decarbonise haulage. So the directive has been written with the concept of pushing transport fuels over electricity, because we've lots of wind turbines and we've lots of ways of decarbonising electricity. We don't have ways of decarbonising haulage. So the emphasis that is in the directive that Aoife announced is there on purpose. It's there to make it readily straightforward to meet sustainability criteria for a sector that's very hard to decarbonise. But what we have done in our research, and what I suppose we're quite concerned about, is in Ireland we have a lot of big gas users. We're looking at the likes of Danone, of Dairygold. We have the 4th largest distillery in Cork producing Jameson whiskey. We have the biggest cheese factory in Cork. We produce 15% of the world's baby formula, and they're evaporation processes. They're not ideally suited to electrification. So a lot of the work we're doing is if you want to have green Guinness, if you want to have green whiskey, if you want to have green cheese, we're going to have to find a renewable source of gas. And the perspective we would have is by digesting byproducts of creameries, of dairies, of whiskey formula. It's probably the only route we have to decarbonise our very extensive agri-tech industry. So the renewable heat market is extremely important, and we've done a very good piece of work in the IEA bioenergy task on fugitive emissions from methane, and we've shown, for example, that rather than having open slurry tanks, we can have a carbon negative system to allow us meet heat criteria to allow us to decarbonise large agri-tech evaporation type processes.
Thanks, Jerry. We have one question for you indeed, Jerry, asking about the contamination. How is it handled for pyrochar? So do you have any opinion how you handle contamination in pyrochar can handle contamination?
We did a paper before with a good colleague in Saudi Arabia, and we looked at the plastic waste in Saudi Arabia associated with a lot of the very large religious festivals, and plastic pyrolyzes very, very well into oils. So I wouldn't see a huge problem with contamination. Now, Chen or Chen might elaborate further, because you're looking at a relatively high temperature process. You're looking at the plastic pyrolyzing. So we have 3 end products from pyrolysis. We have the char, which is concentrated carbon. We have the pyro oil, which is where the plastic would probably end up. And we have some syngas, and that syngas can be used in the satisfying the parasitic demand of the process. So I wouldn't see a problem with contamination, because it's we're normally looking at 180 degrees Celsius, and my understanding is the plastic is gone to oil at that stage. Maybe Chen could elaborate on that one.
And I would generally agree with Jerry that pyrolysis by itself at high temperatures like above 600 degrees would be very powerful in terms of removing all those plastic organics. And indeed, there are research on the pyrolysis of different types of plastics. They are very powerful. But the question, I suppose, would be more focusing on the micro size plastics. I haven't So any research on that, to prove at a macro size, if pyrolysis can eliminate all different size of micro plastics. That would be interesting, actually, especially in terms of the analysis. Any different analytical evidence, to show that will be interesting. But in our lab, we haven't done some research to look at the removal of micro size plastics, unfortunately.
Thanks, Richard. So we are still trying to fix Yan Jiang login because she has troubles logging in. But to match our timings for the session, in case she can join us later, we would like to now start off with our second topic. That's hydrogen economy, which is one of the most interesting topics in renewable energy worldwide. And our first presenter would be Shane McDonough, and he would be speaking about future costs and sources of hydrogen. Before sending it over to Shane, I would like to request you all to keep sending your questions as before, and after the 3 presentations that we have for this topic, and if we can get Yan in, so that would make 4 presentations. If we can get Yan in, we will have another round of Q&A. So over to you, Shane, for describing us the future costs and sources of hydrogen.
Good stuff. I've just requested control if someone could hand that to me. Good stuff. There we go. Okay, good morning everyone. So my name is Shane McDonough. I recently finished my PhD looking at power to gas and subsequent uses, and I'm currently working on means of decarbonising heavy goods vehicles. But this morning I'm talking about sources of hydrogen and their costs in the future. There we go. So first up, if we see how energy is used today, the smallest part is electricity, but it also has the clearest path to decarbonisation through generation and demand. The split may vary, but even in a carbon compliant Paris 2050 situation, non-electric heat and transport make up 70% of the total. Therefore, even ambitious electrification, a huge demand will exist for liquid and gaseous biofuels to meet our 2-degree target, far beyond our ability to produce indigenously. So supplementing this fuel supply with low carbon hydrogen is an option that must be explored. Hydrogen can be fossil or renewable, with or without carbon capture and storage, and it is also the main precursor to advanced fuels. So coal and natural gas for reforming are very mature, proven technologies, but CCS is not. CCS is also not net zero compatible. It has a capture rate of roughly 90%, and in the case of natural gas, you also suffer methane leakage, methane obviously being a powerful greenhouse gas. Also, CO2 storage is not settled or easy, so hydrogen from electrolysis has the advantage due to increased electrification, but it's more complex and more expensive. In this graph, we have a carbon price of about €40 per tonne, but as it reaches about €100 per tonne, the results don't change very much. Only coal without CCS becomes less competitive than renewable hydrogen from electrolysis. The renewable electricity here has a levelized cost of €40 per megawatt hour and a capacity factor of 45%, so very favourable assumptions, and it's still slightly more expensive than natural gas with CCS. It's important to note that converting only surplus or curtailed electricity increases the cost dramatically. So hydrogen from variable renewable electricity won't beat fossil fuel alternatives on costs unless we have a very high carbon price in excess of about €150 per tonne, or secondary incomes and a significant premium. There is the opportunity to charge more for electrolytic hydrogen because it has greater green credentials. So we have the potential to install a lot of offshore wind, and when looking to use the wind, we have three options. We can sell all the electricity, sell all the energy as electricity, which is our benchmark. It's the lowest cost and highest profit solution currently. Number two, we could convert all the power to hydrogen. In order to produce a similar profit to the first system, the cost of producing hydrogen will need to fall by about 30%. And number three, then, we have a hybrid system, whereby the low value electricity is converted to hydrogen and the high value electricity is sold as is. But even in this system, it is less profitable than just selling electricity alone and suffering curtailment. So for example, in order to receive the same net present value, the hydrogen price would need to be €4 per kilogram, and the wind farm would have to anticipate 17% curtailment. So unless the wind farm is being curtailed by something in this region, and we can receive a good price for our hydrogen, it's still more profitable to just sell all your power as electricity. And this is important to note because it's great to say that the levelized cost might be low, but if it's a more attractive alternative for investors to just sell electricity, we need to tweak our incentive structure to try and get them to create hydrogen. This graph then looks at the net present value of an offshore wind to hydrogen facility at various sales prices for H2. So each of these lines represents the increasing profitability of the system as the price of hydrogen increases. Obviously, the higher the sale price, the higher the net present value. And the levelized cost of hydrogen then is the minimum price at which hydrogen has to be sold to make a profit. What we see is that the minimum price we have to sell the hydrogen from offshore wind is much greater than it is for onshore wind, and much greater again than it is for natural gas with CCS. So if we want to use our potential in offshore wind to produce hydrogen, it's important to remember that it's never going to be as cheap as it is from natural gas. So we have to think of other ways of improving the system. Even with ambitious cost reductions out to 2030 and using ideal sites for the offshore wind farm, this figure here, the levelized cost, will move down to about €3 per kilogram at best. In terms of competing with electricity farm, or just selling electricity, I should say, sorry, curtailment alone won't be enough to drive investment. So the net present value of the project is just as important as the levelized cost. And what we see here is if we receive €4.5 per kilogram for hydrogen, it only breaks even with the offshore wind farm when they experience about 8% curtailment. So if the wind farm is experiencing less than 8% curtailment, for example, it's going to be more profitable than selling hydrogen. A hydrogen price that's talked about quite a lot is €4 per kilogram, which would be the equivalent of €1 per litre of diesel. And we can see here that if this is our target sale price, the wind farm would have to experience roughly 25% curtailment before it makes sense to go the hydrogen route, which is probably a level of curtailment that means the farm won't be built in the first place. So a couple of summaries from this. There's a proven demand for biofuels and hydrogen-based fuels as far as 2050. Blue hydrogen will be cheaper, but not net zero carbon. Blue hydrogen being fossil fuels and CCS. Oh, sorry, Tara. Is that you? There you go. Thank you. Electricity is more profitable than hydrogen, even including for high levels of curtailment. So in order to produce hydrogen, we have to think of different business models. And surplus electricity alone doesn't allow for cheap hydrogen. And then finally, monetizing the system benefits is key to hybrid system profitability. You can check out these insights in a paper I wrote, which was linked in one of the previous slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. We are having a problem about lost connection. Tara or Aoife, can you suggest any solution to it? Because I am seeing, because people can't, it seems the video, they can participate in Q&A, but it seems the video has, video and audio have frozen.
Okay, Archie, we will try to re-establish that. We might just move on to the next topic. Thank you.
Thank you. If moving on, we will try to fix the audio and the connections, but we move on to our next presenter, who is Nathan Gray, and he will speak about the role of hydrogen in decarbonizing transport, specifically heavy transport. So Nathan, please.
Lovely. Thank you for the introduction, Archie. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to be presenting on the role hydrogen will play in decarbonising heavy-duty transport in future energy systems. So if we're just able to move on to the first slide there. As Shane alluded to in his presentation, when we talk about our energy system, a significant portion of our energy demand comes from the transport sector, with the transport sector being the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions within the EU. And while passenger transport represents the largest single source of emissions within the transport sector, electric vehicles are a mature technology offering a clear pathway towards emissions reductions. However, as the mass and range of the vehicle increases, electrification becomes increasingly difficult. For example, if a heavy goods vehicle was to be electrified and also have the same range as a diesel equivalent, the batteries required would be heavy enough that the goods carrying capacity of the vehicle would be reduced by around 40%. This means that emissions from heavy-duty transport will be more difficult to fully eliminate, and alternative fuels are likely to be required. So if we're able to move on to the next slide then. And one more slide, please. So as Shane noted in his presentation, there are a number of ways to produce hydrogen, each with their own pros and cons. Once the hydrogen has been produced, there are a range of different utilization pathways within the heavy-duty transport sector, with each sector having its own specific requirements for alternative fuels. The most basic utilization pathway for hydrogen is to compress it to around 700 bar and use it to power fuel cell electric vehicles. Fuel cell electric vehicles are an option for the road haulage and short sea shipping sectors, with companies such as Nikola developing hydrogen-powered heavy goods vehicles, and the Golden Gate Zero Emissions Project set to launch the world's first hydrogen-powered ferry in San Francisco. However, use of hydrogen fuel cells in the aviation sector is unlikely to become a viable option until at least 2050. One thing to consider is that in order to prevent fuel cell degradation, very high purity hydrogen is required. And while the fossil fuel reforming process produces a relatively pure stream of hydrogen, some impurities will remain, meaning its use in fuel cell applications could be limited. However, although compressed hydrogen is more energy dense than batteries, its onboard storage can be bulky and expensive, and it is not applicable to some sectors such as the deep sea shipping and the aviation sector, which are reliant on energy-dense liquid fuels due to the nature of their journeys and refueling patterns. These fuels can be produced in a number of ways, either through combining hydrogen with a CO2 source to create synthetic fuels, or using the hydrogen as a key input in the production of advanced biofuels, such as hydrotreated vegetable oils, which can function as a drop-in replacement for fossil fuels. So moving on to the next slide now. Again, as highlighted by Shane in his presentation, only using otherwise curtailed or wasted renewable electricity to produce hydrogen results in prohibitively high levelized costs, meaning economies of scale are required to minimize the cost of hydrogen, typically with electrolysis capacities of around 10 megawatts and above. This is particularly relevant to the production of synthetic fuels, especially liquid fuels, where the extra processing steps involved also requires economies of scale to be viable. However, due to the extra cost and complexity associated with their production, hydrogen-based synthetic fuels will always be more expensive to produce than the hydrogen itself, meaning that from an economic point of view, it makes sense to use the hydrogen directly wherever possible. Research has shown that the carbon intensity of hydrogen produced electrolytically is almost entirely associated with the carbon intensity of the electricity used in the electrolysis process. Again, while only using renewable electricity to make hydrogen results in very low greenhouse gas emissions, it also results in very high levelized costs. Therefore, to reduce the cost of hydrogen, interaction with the electricity grid is required, which can result in the hydrogen having a large carbon intensity. However, using a wind forecast prediction tool that only turns on the electrolyzers when wind levels are predicted to be high has been shown to reduce the carbon intensity of the hydrogen by up to 47% compared to the grid average. The choice of CO2 source for synthetic electrofuel production is also an important factor. Each source has its own pros and cons, with biogenic or direct air capture offering carbon neutrality, but they are expensive and potentially resource limited, while fossil CO2 captured from industrial processes is generally cheaper, but ultimately the CO2 is still produced from fossil sources. So moving on to the next slide. The well-to-wheel efficiency of the entire system is another important factor that has to be considered. In a vacuum, it is clear that in the example given above for road freight, using hydrogen directly in fuel cell heavy goods vehicles offers superior system efficiencies when compared with the power-to-gas and power-to-liquid pathways. However, there are other factors which need to be considered. For example, the power-to-gas pathway offers the potential for combination with biomethane as a transport fuel, while the power-to-liquid pathway allows for use of existing infrastructure while also offering a pathway to decarbonize modes of transport reliant on energy-dense liquid fuels such as the aviation sector. It is important to note that there is no one single silver bullet solution that is applicable to all modes of heavy-duty transport, with each different fuel production pathway having its own specific niches and applications. And now moving on to the final slide, just to finish up with some perspectives and conclusions. It's clear that economies of scale are required to make electrofuel production viable at large scales. And this is typically around 10 megawatts of electrolyzer capacity and above. And I would suggest that using hydrogen directly in fuel cell vehicles where possible, due to economic and system efficiency benefits, while reserving the use of synthetic fuels for sectors where there are no alternatives, such as deep sea shipping and the aviation sector. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Nathan. It was indeed an interesting presentation. So our final presentation on hydrogen economy looks more in details about using hydrogen. And that presentation will be given by Davis Rusmanis from UCC. So Davis, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Xinmin. Good morning, everyone. So today I'll be giving a quick overview of my research, which so far has focused on the internal workings of a biomethanation system. This internal work will feed into the upcoming projects, which will link this research into the big picture. Next slide. As part of an ongoing project, we are investigating the use of curtailed electricity from small-scale wind turbines for producing hydrogen gas via electrolysis. Utilizing local resources such as dairy slurry or food waste and the generated hydrogen, a source of clean biomethane would be available to fuel the local public transport or injected into the gas grid. Another project, which is in its early stages, looks at a future scenario of high demand for energy storage. Using existing wastewater treatment plants coupled with anaerobic digestion, they can produce biogas from the treated sludge. Upgrading the biogas with the curtailed electricity hydrogen would allow for intercoupling of the electricity and gas sectors, while creating an effective quasi-storage method. Research by Shane McDonough has shown that for production of non-hydrogen electrofuels, production would require to be over 10 megawatts to be viable. However, by pairing waste electricity generated hydrogen with biogas upgrading, oxygen byproduct use for wastewater treatment, and secondary incomes from grid services and other cost savings, the system becomes viable in small scale. Next slide. As part of my previous work, My first paper was a review of the state-of-the-art of biological hydrogen methanation, or BHM for short. The paper compared the existing systems in literature, focusing on the system performance which follows the Sabatier reaction. In addition, I sought to accumulate the available data on gas-to-liquid mass transfer rates, which are shown to be a key aspect in the optimization of BHM systems. Some of the conclusions drawn from this research paper highlights that the mature technologies, such as CSTR systems, may not be optimal for BHM. Rather, an exploration of novel systems is essential. In addition, bubble diffusion presents a gap in the state-of-the-art, where it could play a key role in the bottleneck that is dissolution of hydrogen gas into liquids. Finally, the literature lacks gas-to-liquid transfer data, calling for exploration of this system parameter that is required for optimization of the process. To give a quick overview of the BHM system optimization, we'll treat this black box as a reactor where our resource gas hydrogen and CO2 goes in and our desired gas biomethane leaves. In order to optimize the system, we look at the three main parameters. First, how much loading can the system take before the process deteriorates and we begin to fall short of our desired outcome, which is green injection quality biomethane. Second, how efficient is the process? We want to ensure that the upgrading is as fast as possible. And third, how effective is the process in producing our desired outcome, clean biomethane? These three parameters in our system are represented in the form of methane evolution rate, or MER, which tells us how many volumes of biomethane can be produced per volume of reactor liquid. The retention time dictates how long the gas resides within the system, and finally the purity, which shows how clean the product gas is when exiting the process. And these three parameters can be improved by altering the reactor environments, which can be done through pressure, temperature, microbial fauna, and hydrogen dissolution, among others. And this overall system can then be evaluated in its ability to dissolve hydrogen by analyzing the gas to liquid transfer rates. Next slide. The research has shown that optimized reactor systems are scarce in literature. As we can see here, the three parameters MER, retention time, and purity can be compared across the papers. The values, however, vary significantly, where one parameter has been maximized at the sacrifice of the other two. However, a project by Electrolysis, based in Denmark, appears to have had success in optimizing a BHM demonstration plant, achieving high loading at efficient and effective rates. This can be attributed to their high pressure, thermophilic temperatures, patented microbe strains, and rapid mixing rates, allowing for extremely efficient process. Next slide. Coming back to our group, with knowledge gained from this research, we've been working with engineering companies to design and build a state-of-the-art Bhm Rig. The system is designed with modularity in mind, comprising of 3 reactors, allowing for a variety of system arrangements. The rig contains 3 reactors and 1 expansion vessel, allowing for the reactors to be run independently of one another, in series, or in parallel flows, with a total of 8 unique system setups, with room for upgrades in the future. Some of the upcoming research from my studies will focus on the optimization of this system, as well as commissioning and testing it to explore the typical issues encountered with this novel upgrading system. Next slide. Previous research done by a colleague of mine, Marcus Fulklein, in early 2019 simulated a 3-reactor cascading system, which was capable of producing grid-quality biomethane from a hydrogen and CO2 mixture. Our methanation rig, inspired by this research, seeks to first and foremost test the hypothesized system. So that's a quick overview of some of my past and present works, and I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention, and if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks, Davis. Thanks a lot. So we come to the end of this session, and we would have time for some Q&A. Just to start our Q&A, could I ask Shane, because I saw a lot of people missed your presentation because of some connection errors. Could you please run it, just give a very brief overview of your presentation? So just to open the floor for the Q&A session. Shane, is it possible for you?
Yeah, it's possible. If you wouldn't mind just giving me back control as well, I'll very quickly flick through slides just to maybe better highlight and answer questions a bit quicker. So
Shane, I'd say you could give it 3 or 4 minutes because we're not behind time. So
yeah,
and
that's perfect.
I think
So,
if you concentrate on the electrolysis and the hybrid model, it would be helpful.
cool. So I'm just trying to get slides back up here now. Right here. It might be easier, Tara, if I just click this. What happened was there was an offset between my cursor and the actual thing on screen. Yeah. No, now it seems to have gone again. Hold on. If whoever's in control can just hit allow on that, and I'll try and. There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tara. There we go. Great. So very quickly, this slide is just to demonstrate that most of our advancements have been in the area of renewable electricity. There we go. But even in a Paris compliant energy system in 2050, the vast majority of our energy is met through gaseous and liquid fuels. The grey area here representing the proportion of which needs to be renewable. So there's a huge proven demand for renewable liquid and gaseous fuels in the future, far beyond what we have the ability to produce indigenously. So supplementing this with hydrogen is an option that needs to be investigated. We can produce hydrogen from fossil fuels or from the electrolysis of renewable electricity. Fossil fuels will be much cheaper in the interim, but they're not net zero compliant. There's a roughly 90% capture rate on the CO2, and there's issues of methane leakage. When we look at comparing costs and CO2 between renewable and blue hydrogen again being fossil fuel with CCS, we can see that renewable hydrogen is actually more expensive. This is representative of €40 per megawatt hour levelized cost and a €40 per ton of CO2 cost. And it's not until the price of CO2 goes into the region of €150 per ton does renewable electrolysis begin to compete with natural gas, carbon capture and storage. So the three options we have in the future, if we build large amounts of offshore wind, are number one, to sell all the power to the grid. It's the lowest cost, highest profit solution and is the benchmark for investor attractiveness. Number two is convert all the power to hydrogen. And what we find is that in order for an investor to choose this option, the costs associated with hydrogen production would need to fall by roughly 30%. So that would mean selling your hydrogen at €4 per kilogram would give an equal profit to selling all your power as electricity. And then finally, we look at hybrid systems. So a hybrid system aims to maximize profits by selling low value electricity as hydrogen and high value electricity as electricity on the grid. So by playing both markets off one another to try and maximize profits. But what we find is the additional cost and complexity of installing hydrogen means that a minimum of €4 per kilogram for hydrogen, so that's the equivalent of €1 per litre of diesel, and roughly 17% curtailment need to be anticipated. So a hybrid system, or even a system that converts to hydrogen, is best suited to wind farms that anticipate high levels of curtailment or have issues with grid capacity and constraint. So curtailment alone will not be enough to drive investment, but if your wind farm anticipates high levels of curtailment, it boosts the argument for hydrogen production. Focusing just on this for a small bit, so this further highlights why curtailment alone is not enough to drive investment. And what we see here is this is our black line is our levelized cost of hydrogen for offshore wind, which is about 377. If we're to assume our selling price of hydrogen of €4, in order for a system that produces just hydrogen to provide an equal profit to the offshore wind farm selling electricity alone, you can see the lines cross here. So an offshore wind farm experiencing 25% curtailment is as profitable as a hydrogen system selling at €4. And obviously 25% curtailment is very, very significant. And the likelihood is that the farm would not be built if the developer expected that in the first place. We can see then, compared to the levelized costs of hydrogen from onshore wind and from natural gas, it's difficult to compete. And so the business model needs to change in order for this to become more attractive to investors. In terms of competing with electricity alone, we see that a sale price of roughly $4.50 per kilogram is required if the wind farm anticipates perhaps less than 10% curtailment. So the highlight here is that curtailment alone is not enough to drive investment in power to gas, and that the net present value is also an important thing to keep an eye on. And when we focus on a hybrid system, we look at selling our hydrogen into higher value markets to help minimize lost revenue due to low electricity prices, more so than try and increase profits. So again, hydrogen helps us to minimize the amount of money we don't make because of fluctuations in the electricity market, more so than increase our profitability. And so just a couple points to summarize there. The most important, I think, would be electricity is more profitable than hydrogen. So we need to think of things like selling grid services, perhaps acting as storage mechanisms, and then monetizing the system benefits are key to the hybrid system profitability. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Shane, for a brief run through. We should expect a few questions now, but it's for all the presenters with hydrogen that we have here. So one of the major questions about hydrogen is the implementation. There is a lot of research going on, but maybe it's an open question for any of you who would like to answer is, what do you think about the implementation of hydrogen in future, and when do you expect hydrogen to be a major player in future? If any one of you would like to answer, Nathan, Shane, or Davis.
I can jump in. If I can just rephrase the question, you're asking when will hydrogen become a major player in the energy system?
Yeah.
Hydrogen, similar to all other renewable energy, is going to be dependent on incentives for quite a while. And we currently don't see those incentives. And one of the things I try to highlight in my work is that curtailment alone is not enough to drive investment in hydrogen. And so we need to look at things like flexible demand markets. So perhaps if the electricity system was reconfigured such that we can incentivize flexible demand in a similar way we incentivize flexible generation, then hydrogen becomes part of the mix. But until, number one, the electricity market is rejigged in such a way that electrolytic hydrogen can compete in more than one market, and until such a time that carbon capture and storage at scale becomes proven, then it's difficult to see hydrogen making inroads. So to summarize, we need to figure out legacy issues around CO2 storage at scale, and we need to incentivize flexible demand in the electricity market in order to make room for hydrogen.
Thanks, Shane. Just queuing up from your question. So maybe not, Nathan, what do you think about hydrogen in fuel? Like, we know there are hydrogen cars coming up, but we don't see it. There is a rapid rise in hydrogen cars like we have electric cars. So what's your view on having a lot of hydrogen in transport sector or for heavy industries?
Yes, so I mean, my opinion would be that hydrogen is best suited to displace diesel within the heavy goods sector. You know, I think hydrogen cars really are a bit of a non-runner in terms of the like I said, the overall system efficiencies, the system efficiencies for battery electric cars are much higher than for hydrogen cars, whereas the heavy duty transport sector is such that electrification isn't possible. So hydrogen is able to step into that sector and play a role by allowing the transportation of goods over long distances with similar ranges to the diesel trucks that we have today. So I suppose that would be my perspective on the role of hydrogen within the trucking sector.
And do you find how do you see the policy or global interest in maybe hydrogen and other novel fuels in transport? Do you see like a lot of people interested from a policy perspective, or you see a lot of inertia in trying to change into novel fuels for transport?
I think from a policy perspective, I think the sort of the heavy duty transport, so your haulage, your shipping, and your aviation sector have sort of been neglected from a policy point of view. So a lot of policies have gone into trying to incentivize people to switch to electric cars with tax subsidies or whatever, whereas the heavy duty transport has been neglected to an extent. So I think that's an area that there's definitely room for improvement.
If I may there, Archie, that I think the area of electrofuels is quite exciting going forward, going from hydrogen, reacting with CO2 to make methane, or going on to make methanol and biokerosene. There's a very exciting project at a very initial stage in Germany where they're looking at very large-scale electrolysis from offshore wind in the North Sea. They see that oxygen being a very important component. They see capture of CO2 from cement manufacture, reacting with the hydrogen, and eventually going on to biokerosene for aviation. And if you look at the alternatives to decarbonize aviation and ferries, we're not looking at electrification for flights going from London to Shanghai or London to Los Angeles. So I think the electrofuels, and I think a concept of having vast quantities of offshore wind to bring us to 100% decarbonisation of electrification will lead to large periods of mismatch between supply and demand. And I think the opportunity there is to try and make hydrogen at a reasonable cost, as Shane would testify, to go on to maybe liquid fuels such as biokerosene, methanol, to decarbonise heavy trucks, ferries and aviation.
Thanks, Jerry, for your wonderful clarification. I have a couple of questions for Davis. Davis, one of the questions asked was the importance of mass transfer to assist this formation of methane. And if you can answer along with this, do you have any specific quality of CO2 that you would need as a limitation for your biomethanation process?
Thanks, Archie. So they're good questions. The answer is kind of, it's kind of broad, because at the end of the day, yes, the gas liquid mass transfer rate is strongly influenced by the reactor environment or the bioreactor configuration. A lot of the papers in literature kind of have a very large variance in the transfer rates, as well as the primary properties that I kind of mentioned in the presentation. And it all kind of alludes to how optimized is the system, or how far is the research. Like, what are the most noticeable parameters or bioreactor configurations is the microbes within the reactor itself, which, like, across papers, if you have standard liquors or microbes from like an AED process that have been essentially enriched or altered a bit, they produce 10 times less than reactors containing such enriched cultures or pure cultures, such as the plant in Denmark. So it depends on how optimized the reactor is, and yes, the system and the configuration of the reactor will have a strong effect, because like pressures and temperatures will all have a strong contribution to the overall gas to liquid transfer rates. In regards to the quality of CO2, again, it depends on how efficient is the system or how capable is the reactor at converting the gas from hydrogen and CO2 to methane. So ideally, you want to maximize the volumes you can put through and the quality. I see Jerry's.
Yeah, I think I do apologize. We're ending this session, Davis. I do thank you for your question. I'm told, and again, I'm not a technology expert, that at 10:50, which is now, that we wrap up this session, and we now go on to the next two topics, which is biogas production and biogas upgrading. The link will have been sent to everybody in advance. It's also on the screen, so if you look at that link on the screen, that will take you into the next session, and it's also on Twitter. We do apologize for the loss of connectivity. Again, we're not in control of the larger sphere of Microsoft Office. You know, we did have a problem. We do apologize. We hope the next session doesn't cause any problems, but we would ask you to join us on this link. So this session ends because Microsoft Teams has a maximum duration of 3 hours, and we'll start again on topic 3 and topic 4 on biogas production and biogas upgrading. I want to thank all the speakers in session 1 and the organisers. I think it was a very good session. We hope to talk to you all in session 2, which will start straight away. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jerry.
Oh, it starts at 11, I understand. So time for coffee.